Okay, here we go. Welcome, everyone. My name is Lucy Gray, and I am an ed tech uh, consultant out in the internets. And this is a group that we started, Don Buckley and I, earlier this year, called Actionable Innovations Conversations. And the purpose of our group is to kind of come together every Friday and connect. And in this age of coronavirus, we have felt that it's really important, if we're going to keep moving ourselves forward and our schools forward that we work with, that we need to kind of keep in touch. And so we've been inviting people in whose work really interests us to share what they've been up to, particularly during this crazy time, and to kind of rebuild the community that we have felt has been really pivotal in our careers along the way. And one of the people I met early on was Dr. Scott McLeod, who's here today. And Scott, how long has it been? Steve started doing, there's probably EduBloggerCon 2006, 7, something like that. Do you remember like what it was like back in those days?
I remember what it was like 15 years ago. Yeah, I'm not that old yet.
But like, don't you feel like it's kind of missing that community feeling that we used to have? And I think it was flagging before COVID a little bit, but I think there's space out there for kind of getting people together again a little bit. And we're glad to have you here today.
Thank you. I absolutely agree. There's lots of space for bringing people back together. There's just a lot more people playing than there used to be. So it's, we're more dispersed than we were back in the early days.
That's true. That's absolutely true. And because, back then we considered ourselves kind of pioneers, I think, with ed tech, or we were kind of the outliers. And now I think in this day and age, you can't get away with not using technology to some degree. So you're right. I think the field has really grown and expanded, and that's absolutely true. Don, do you want to step in and say hello?
Hey, everyone.
Do you want to talk about your Proust questionnaire and feed a couple questions to Scott before we get started today?
Yeah, I can. So who reads Vanity Fair? Anyone on the call? Susie does, of course. Hey, Susie. Just give me a second, guys. So if you don't read Vanity Fair, but if you went to the very last page, there's always something called the Proust Questionnaire. And it was designed by Marcel Proust, and not, or is it Proust? Correct
Proust.
me. Proust, Jessica?
Proust.
Welcome to America, Don. It's Proust.
Is it?
Proust.
It is Proust. Okay.
Okay, all right. So apparently he sort of came up with this idea of these sort of like questionnaires, and they would sort of play out in these Victorian salons where people would take this questionnaire and then it would bring up sort of ideas and things. And so I've had like 3 attempts at making podcasts, and they've miserably failed. And it's because it's all about the interview questions, right? And so when Lucy and I were talking about this junto and what we might do, I thought, God, why don't I just think about using the Proust questionnaire and see how that plays out? And so I sort of forgot about it. And then I came across it the other day again. I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a Medium article and just Proust questionnaire myself. So I put it up, and it was a big hit. Like, people just found it funny, and the things that I came out with. And so I sort of adopted it from what Marcel did to an education version, and that's what I did. And so, yeah, that's the Proust questionnaire. You don't want me to show some questions, do you, Lucy? Or?
I thought you would spring a few on Scott.
Oh, okay.
And as kind of a warm up for today.
Okay, so here we go, Scott. What is your idea of perfect happiness?
So I'll answer some of these questions if other people chime in the chat. How's that?
Great.
To me, I think my ideal of perfect happiness right now is basically just hanging out with my wife and my dog and my kids. My kids are older, so we don't all get together that often. So when it does, that's probably as close to ideal as I've got right now.
Okay.
I mean,
Right.
other than blowing up every school in the world to be different, but
We have choice in how I spend time, family and friends, happiness. Happiness is a beagle dog. Okay. How about this one, Scott? What do you consider the most overrated virtue? I just give you, my one was consistency. That's how
I'm trying to think if I could name virtues. That about me. Let me pass on that one.
Okay.
I had to Google that, and I had to Google like a list of virtues to look at, and the one that I picked was cleanliness. And because I'm just right now, we're in my house is kind of disheveled because we had a flood in it, and everybody's kind of stuck in their rooms because 2 kids have had COVID this week, and so cleanliness has been. But then I thought, well, cleanliness has been kind of like huge right now with COVID, so maybe it should be more valued. I don't know, but right now we're not valuing cleanliness as a virtue.
Right. How about this one?
Obedience.
Yeah. How about this one, Scott? What words or phrases do you most overuse? Mine was the word amplify.
I tend to overuse, how's that working for you?
All right, hope that works out for you. Okay. What is your current state of mind? Mine is wandering.
Delighted right now. I'm delighted to be with all of you and see some smiling, happy old friends and new friends.
Okay, and last one. What is your most treasured possession? Mine is tote bags.
Fascinating.
Mine is things like vinyl stick and stuff.
Photos. I think family photos.
Great. Okay. All right, Lucy, is that good, or should I stop or go on?
No, that's perfect. That's perfect. And if you want to see Don's answers, I will put the link in the chat. And I did one last night too, but I added a couple of questions to it, Don. So if anybody actually wants to write theirs down and submit it to our Medium publication, you're more than welcome to. It's just a kind of a fun way to see where people's minds are at and what they're thinking and what motivates them. And I really think it's a great exercise, Don, to kind of break the ice and get people situated. And you said you were going to even try it with your students, Don, your entrepreneurship students at Marymount, right?
Yeah, I'm definitely going to do it with the students, with the design thinking students for sure. Yeah. Yeah, and there's lots of versions. You can alter all the questions and stuff like that, and shorten it and longer it. But yeah, it's a good sort of where is someone at, and a great way to get to know, I think. I'm pretty light as well. The current one in this month's Vanity Fair is Mel Brooks, in case you're interested.
Oh, fun. I'll have to look that up. Okay, so I'm going to turn this over to Scott. Scott, feel free to introduce yourself formally and jump into what you want to chat with us about. And then we'll use the remaining time for conversation and discussion and reflection. But this is really kind of a low-key thing. So we're excited to hear what you've been thinking about, what you've been up to. I know that deeper learning is a passion of yours. I've also was interested in your blog post about how people help schools. So take it away, Scott, and we're so happy to have you here. So thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a professor of educational leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver. This is my 5th university and hopefully my last. I teach the classes that teachers take if they want to be principals. I occasionally teach a superintendency course. I have some doctoral students. I'm also the founding director of a university center called Castle. Castle, like storming the castle, is the nation's only university center that's really dedicated to leadership and innovation, technology, and deeper learning and all that good stuff. And in that capacity, I get to work with schools all around the world in terms of what does it mean to prepare a future-ready graduate? What does it mean to be a future-ready school system? All the big existential questions that we tend to wrestle with and so on. I'm known as a very sort of practical, hands-on, roll up your sleeves, let's work together faculty member. I'm not an ivory tower guy, who howls up in his office and writes a bunch of articles that nobody reads, although I do some of that, of course. So I'm gonna actually share my screen for just like 5 minutes and just share a couple different things about me and what I do and what I work on, and then we'll open up for conversation. I'm not gonna talk at you very long here. So hopefully you all now see a beautiful Colorado mountain stream. Yes, okay, thank you. I'm just gonna say, first of all, thank you to the Actionable Innovations crew for inviting me here today. You all are doing some really great work. I just appreciate the chance to be part of the community and share a little bit about what I'm doing today. The schools that I work with are focused on 4 big shifts. That first one is the shift in cognitive complexity. How do we get beyond factual recall and procedure regurgitation, move up Bloom's taxonomy or around Webb's depth of knowledge wheel, and really get kids engaged in those higher level or deeper level thinking tasks that we know they need. Research tends to show us that about 80 to 85% of a kid's day-to-day school experience is low-level recall and regurgitation. In the Global Innovation Society, that's deadly. And so we've got to do better than that. The schools that I'm working with are also trying to figure out how do we make school more student-directed, not just student-centered, and how do we give control and ownership over to the young people that we serve. The cognitive psychologists tell us over and over again that the #1 factor in human motivation is autonomy. Unfortunately, schools are low autonomy or low agency places for most students. We tell them what to do almost every minute of every day, and then we wonder why they're bored and apathetic and disengaged. #3, authentic work. I think we're finding a lot of power in getting kids outside the walls of the school building, metaphorically, figuratively, literally, and getting them engaged in real world authentic tasks, whether those be through internships, capstones, service learning projects, community impact projects, genius hours, whatever it takes, where kids can find meaning and relevance in the learning work in a different way than sort of the isolated, disconnected classrooms that we throw them in. And then of course, technology, and that's really where Castle and I started, is what does it mean to be a really effective technology leader? That has morphed into the deeper learning work. And we want kids to be information literate, we want kids to be tech fluent, but more importantly, technology is a really powerful lever for those first 3 shifts, which is really where the power is. It's not just tech for tech's sake. So the schools that I work with are playing around with a lot of different stuff, everything from project and inquiry-based learning, flexible schedules and redesigned learning spaces. They're playing around with one-to-one computing. They're trying to figure out what standards-based grading and competency-based progressions might look like. They're trying to figure out how to throw kids into authentic real-world situations. They're playing around with badges and alternative credentialing. They're trying to figure out how to get kids positively engaged in online communities. They're playing around with adaptive software and all the different things, right? So I get to, depending on who I'm working with, live in a lot of different spaces, which is really fun. My work right now is falling into kind of 3 big buckets. The first one is instructional redesign with classroom teachers and instructional coaches and maybe principals and anybody else who wears an instructional leadership hat. A few years back, we released the 4 shifts protocol. That is a free tool that anybody can access. Just go to bit.ly/4shifts, and I'll throw that in the chat here in just a second. And what you will see is that there's a section for each of those 4 shifts that I mentioned. So here's the student agency section, for instance, and you see that there are 9 different items here that we can play around with when it comes to student agency and ownership of their own learning. And so the work that I do with teachers and coaches and principals is, if a lot of your answers here keep coming up as teacher, 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 or no, 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 how do we start doing those redesign pivots using the protocol to start moving things in a different direction? So there's a section for student agency, there's a section for real world work, there's a section for deeper learning, there's a section for tech infusion. And so we're having a lot of great success with the protocol. We've got tens of thousands of educators who are now using it, which is pretty fun. And I think one of the reasons is because it's much more specific than a SAMR framework, a TPAC framework, maybe even EEE or some of these other frameworks that are out there that don't really tell teachers what to shift or what to change, right? But the protocol is specific and concrete enough for those look forwards and think abouts that people are really grabbing onto it pretty substantially. So that's fun. I'm a leadership guy. So the second big bucket of work that I'm doing with school systems is really around the systems in which that's kind of learning and teaching is embedded, right? So what are those key leadership behaviors? What are those important organizational support structures that are necessary to make rich, robust learning happen? Just engaged in a book project that just finished up, which we're pretty excited about. We identified 30 innovative schools around the world that were doing some really cool stuff, but maybe hadn't gotten a lot of attention. We didn't need another book on High Tech High. We interviewed all 30 principals, and the driving question was, what do school leaders in innovative schools do that's different from school leaders in more traditional settings? We did site visits for 28 of the schools before the pandemic hit. We have lots of rich observations. Every chapter in the book ends with, those key leadership behaviors and support structures that we observed. We've got a profile of a deeper learning leader. It's really excited about this work. This book just came out this past summer. And then the third sort of bucket of work that I'm doing, and I'll just describe this quickly, is, like many of you, I get invited to do a lot of these one-offs, where come talk at our conference or come keynote our school district, kickoff, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Do a couple of workshops for us, really trying to do a lot more long-term engagements with folks. I've been doing sort of long-term innovation academies or school district partnerships since about 2008 or so, right? So just to give an example of what these might look like, North Dakota gave me 72 of its school leaders from 14 school districts, and we met for 7 days over the course of a year. And we had some amazing conversations over the course of that school year. They brought leadership teams, and then they implemented action projects the next year that I've been supporting. We've got an initiative in Virginia right now that the first year was 30 school districts. The first year, we had about 180 school leaders that joined us for 6 days over the course of a year, to sort of figure out how do we start adjusting to the new state profile of a graduate. The next year, they added another 30 districts. They're adding more districts. That's now at least a 70, 75 school district initiative where they're meeting regularly throughout the year, supporting each other, doing ongoing coaching, and so on. I've got a school district in Roanoke, Virginia right now, for instance, where we are doing both protocol work and leadership development work. That started in the summer, and I've been working them all throughout the fall and into the spring. We just meet multiple times. Got a school district in Illinois that we just started in December, and we'll be working together all through the spring. And those longer term engagements, as we know, right, are much more impactful, because what it does, it allows us to really unpack systems, to really provide ongoing coaching. And you see just much greater impacts than you might see, with the one-off conference keynote or a couple of workshops, and then you fly out and so on. So really, I'm trying to lean pretty heavily into the longer term work as often as possible. And that's been really fun. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Let's stop there, and whoever's in charge of conversation and following your lead. That's me.
I'll start and then I'll pass it off to anybody else who wants to ask a question. I'm wondering, my feeling in Illinois, where I'm based, looking at local schools, or the few that I've had interaction with, whether it's been through my own kids or through recent job interviews or whatever, that everybody's kind of paralyzed because of COVID. And even if COVID wasn't going on, there's still this static adherence to traditional teaching and learning. I don't see a lot of innovation going on in large scale American high schools. In Europe, schools are much smaller, and maybe it's easier to be nimble then. I don't know. But here, the traditional American high school factory model seems to be really hard to shift. And I'm not seeing it sounds like you're really able to scale with your concrete, tools and that sort of thing. What's your general feeling about American schools in general, what you're seeing, and are they capable of shifting and moving? One of the interviews I'll tell you some other time about the interviews I've been on recently and the kind of questions I've been asked, and it's really kind of alarming to me. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what you're seeing as a whole, and our capacity to change.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for the question, Lucy. So, this work is, 2 steps forward, 1.99 steps back. But I have seen some change over the last, 10, 15 years in terms of just the number of schools that are doing this work. I think a couple of things that are really helpful for us all to remember. Number one is our mindset about what school should look like and how it operates are deeply, deeply embedded into our collective psyche, right? You can go to anybody, anywhere and say the word school and a whole host of images pop into people's minds about what school should look like. And the kind of learning and teaching and leadership that, many of us are trying to foster doesn't look much like that. And so we've just got sort of instinctive resistance and historical inertia that we're combating. And every time we try to make a little move forward, it drops back for whatever reason. Community pushback, the superintendent left, whatever, test scores dropped momentarily and everybody freaked out. Like there's all kinds of things that sort of work against it. But the biggest problem is our mindset about what we want learning to look like for kids. The second thing to remember is this. It's a pandemic. Right. And so, even the school districts and schools that were making some progress on this pre-pandemic have basically just put most of that work on pause if it wasn't too deeply rooted, right? Because in survival mode, and during survival mode, many places have just been reverting back to the most simplest forms of learning and teaching that they can find, which unfortunately is traditionally, worksheet and homework packet type stuff. So, what I have found is that people's appetite for this deeper learning and leadership work is very scant right now because, I can't go to Phil and his school district and be like, hey, Phil, you know how we had this massive disruption for the last 2 years? Well, let's do a second one on top of that. Let's blow up school, right? And all of Phil's educators are gonna be like, are you high? Like, are you nuts? Like, there's no way that's happening, right? And I think that's sort of the problem right now is that at best we can do baby steps, even in good times. And during the pandemic, most people are like, ooh, we just gotta wait on that till later, even if they agree with the direction that we need to go.
Lucy, I think you're
It's the classic.
I'm rookie mistake, right? So what are we going to do to? So how do we get schools to kind of move out of this if we are coming out of the pandemic, which is a big if right now? How do we gradually get back to a place where schools have more capacity? Do you think, are you seeing signs of that? And how do we get back on track with innovating?
Phil, you want to take first shot of that?
I'm very interested in this. We're in a unique opportunity. We have a brand new superintendent this year, and of course he is immediately saying, okay, we haven't done a strategic plan in our district for 10 years. Why don't we do a strategic plan? It's a great time to do that. Like you said, reinvent yourself. And I have a feeling, Lucy, kind of to answer your question as well. I have a feeling that we're in the calm before the storm, because with so many superintendents retiring and saying, I give up and I'm done, and principals are doing the same thing and teachers are doing the same thing. At the same time, I know there's evidence that there are teacher colleges that are out there that are closing because they don't have enough students, because there's not enough people that want to be teachers. But I do know that there are a lot of young teachers. One of my daughters, this is her first year teaching, and her student teaching was during the pandemic. I mean, she was well equipped for what she's taking over right now this year. And there's going to be a number of those teachers that are coming forward. And then there'll be a number of those teachers that have been excited to use innovative techniques in their classroom, and now they have every reason in the world to do so and to continue to do so. And with a new influx of hopefully new administrators and new superintendents that are willing to stick it out or meet the new challenges of the new normal, I think, like I said, the calm before the storm. I think we're going to really start to see, we have no excuse to go back to the way things used to be. Except for the fact that that's easier and that's simpler, right? I mean, and that's the easy road. But is that really what's going to get us through the next pandemic that comes along? we need innovative thinkers, and I think we're on the precipice of that, really. I went back to school. I'm working on my doctoral program right now. I just got my superintendent certificate, so I'm excited to go do that now. As soon as I finish my doctorate, but and get out there and do that and try to hopefully lead the charge. And I don't know if I'm the same age as you, Scott, but I'm a little older, and I feel like it's towards the end of my career, but at the same time I want to finish strong. So
Phil, I admire your hope. I kind of feel that way too. But change is slow. And I think, for those of us who are impatient, we just have to remember that. Lucy, I think for me, I keep reminding myself of the importance of the why. For those of us who live on the edges of school innovation, that why was answered a long time ago. And yet I still find that having the conversations about the why are really, really important to educators today, to community members and parents, to business and community leaders and so on, right? And it sounds funny because we've been talking about the why for a really long time, but we just haven't made the kind of dent yet that we need to. So I actually find that a lot of my time working with schools is actually talking about the why, right? Because you have to have that buy-in and maybe a little sense of urgency. And parents and community members can actually help with that why because they get it. And then we can talk about, and then I also find that a lot of my work is focused on what could it look like instead, because they don't know. They haven't seen it, they haven't experienced it, and so on. And then once we've had those two conversations, the why and the what, then we can talk about the how. How do we get there, right? But I think another problem for us is that we tend to throw these big grandiose solutions out there, right? Like give all your kids a computer and then, there's nothing to sort of make it work on the back end. So we just replicate what we've always done. And we're like, we're going to throw a whole bunch of teachers into, massive PBL projects, right? And then, for a traditional teacher to all of a sudden jump into a 4-week PBL project, that's a really big jump. And I think we need tools. And I think, like the protocol has been very successful because it doesn't ask you to blow up your classroom for the next 4 weeks. It says, take that thing you're doing next Tuesday and make a couple tweaks in it and give kids a little more agency and build your capacity, build your students' capacity, and build it over time. And we need more of those structures to help people with the how and sort of these bridging mechanisms to these larger grandiose visions of what we think learning could look like. And we're just not doing that work often.
It sounds to me that we need to do more consistent communicating with community and families about what this looks like. And I think back to Pam Moran when she was a superintendent and she would educate her board. She would have them read, she'd have them go to conferences. I mean, this is years ago. And she took it upon herself to lead them where she wanted them to go. And I feel like we've kind of gotten away from that. And we're going to continue to get away from that with school boards, the way that they're becoming politicized. If we're not mindful about that intentionality, and like it's so I think these are some really good points. Anybody else want to jump in here and ask a question? Don't just unmute your mic and go for it.
David?
Yeah, more than a question, just one of the things that that I found is that coming off of this, still in the pandemic, but it was sort of important for our team to sort of get out of feeling in survival mode all the time and to start asking these professional questions. And it was actually, I think, very helpful and cathartic to sort of think about something else beyond the pandemic. And so I think that's part of the opportunity that I see too, is that there's this need to have, at least in our particular context, but I would imagine elsewhere as well, there's this need to have conversations beyond how many kids are positive this morning, and to come back to what it was to be teaching and to be thinking about those things, right? Like it's just, there's this fatigue, and it's helpful to be able to shift that conversation. It has been for us.
I jump in with a question.
Yeah,
for
go
Scott.
ahead, Susie.
First, I want to share that I just love Scott's new book. He and his team put together a really beautiful look at, as he's saying, the what. But what I'm curious about is in those schools that you profiled that really show us what school can be, when it looks like, when it feels differently, how have they gotten really clear about the why? Any short stories or examples you can share about what, catalyzed that? How do they keep it really clear and present, and what other people could learn from that?
Yeah, absolutely, Susie. Thank you for the kind words and the book testimonial and all the ongoing support over the years. It's great to see you again. One of the distinctions we make in the book is the distinction between a startup school and a transitioning school. So, if you start a brand new charter school that's dedicated to deeper learning, you just got a green field, to play in and run in, and you just hire your staff who share that mission, and you just start building structures and going. That's very different from, your local high school down the street who's trying to think differently, but has all that historical inertia that they are combating. So for the transitioning schools, what we have found is that most of that work actually started out with some smaller scale pilots, right? Like, we know that we need to do some things differently for kids, or we've got this group of students and families over here that's not doing super great in our current configuration. They just need something different. So let's create something different for 20 kids, 50 kids, 100 kids. Let's try it out. Let's see what happens, right? And then as we sort of plant that seed and grow it, other people start going, oh, what's going on there? I want my kid to do some of that, right? And so that side initiative that was targeted towards some underserved students or families starts to grow, and that might become a full-blown alternative program. It might become a school within a school, right? And so on. And so we're getting more comfortable in schools with this idea of pathways, right? That we have a diversity of humanity that's walking through the school door every day. We have to stop pretending that every single kid needs the exact same thing from us. What are different pathways that we can provide, right? And if we can provide 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 pathways, that's better than 1 or 2 pathways, right? And we're trying to figure out how to meet everybody's needs in a different way. And I think we're getting better at that. But I think that's what that conversation looks like in a transitioning high school, for instance. One of the things that I'm really interested in is that a lot of this deeper learning work that's happening at the high school level is starting to push down into middle schools a little bit, and maybe a little bit into elementaries. Meanwhile, we have the rich traditions of Montessori, Waldorf, Reggio Emilia pushing up from the pre-K world. So I got a sabbatical coming up. I want to look at what deeper learning looks like in elementary and middle schools, because they're out there. They just don't get as much attention because of the younger students. But we've got forces both directions moving into elementary and middle. We don't know a lot about deeper learning in elementary and middle schools. So that's what my sabbatical is going to be about. I'm pretty excited.
So Lucy, you pushed stuff into the chat. I can't use the chat in this device I'm on, so I think I know what you're talking about. Was it the stuff from The Human Element, that book?
Yeah, we were talking, one of the things that's been a little bit of a conundrum in our community, Scott, has been like, how do we get people to teach, to share, participate, teach in this community, because when everybody's kind of beleaguered. And so we've been talking about motivation a little bit. I wish Bill was here today. Bill Rankin, I don't think he's in the audience. He was talking a lot about this at one of our previous ones. And then Don kind of piggybacked that on this in a one-on-one conversation, talking about the ability for educators to be able to reframe for themselves and then for their institutions. And there were 4 things that you told me, Don. Inertia, was it emotion, reactance?
Yeah,
Autonomy,
inertia,
I think.
Inertia, effort, emotion, and reactance. They were the 4. So I don't know if you guys, it's a pretty new book, The Human Element. It was written by 2 profs out of Kellogg Business School. And it's basically overcoming the resistance that awaits new ideas. So they use the analogy of a bullet. So when you fire a bullet from a gun, what makes that work? And most people say, oh, if you do that, it's all about the gunpowder. But the thing is, it's not just about the gunpowder. It's like wind resistance, gravity, aerodynamics. There's a lot of other factors in it. So what they do is they take that and they identify the frictions that happen when you're trying to affect change. And the first one they talk about is inertia, which is you really need to ask if this change is significant or a modest change from the status quo of what you're trying to change. And because if it's not modest, there's a huge inertia to that, something to think about. The second one was effort. So how costly is the physical exertion to adopt this new thing? How much cognitive effort do you need to use with or work with it or integrate with it? The third friction was emotion. What negative or undesired feelings does the idea cause? How much anxiety, trepidation, fear does it cause? And the last one was, which I thought was really interesting, was reactance. So that's people's aversion to being changed by others or losing their autonomy. So they were the sort of four frictions that they identified. Was that, Lucy, was that what you were talking about?
Yeah, and then
Okay.
in a previous conversation, talking about the common theme is autonomy. I mean, I think this is a big theme and probably I would think in Scott's work too, of teachers being able to have the ability to tweak and play and experiment and be engaged. And Bill Rankin brought up, he's been writing a chapter of a book, and he brought up some research that I have the PDF here, from two professors at University of Rochester, Richard Ryan and Edward Pecci, I think it's PECI, on self-determination theory and the facilitation of intrinsic motivation, social development, and well-being. And it was very interesting. It talks, and autonomy is one of the four things that everybody needs. And I just think that's, how many of these schools are kind of embracing different mindsets for their teachers, Scott, in order to this to happen? How are they getting to that place where they can say, we're okay with giving we trust our teachers. We're going to give them some autonomy because we feel like they're the experts. How do the schools that you're working with, how do they value teachers, and how do they get them there? And have you seen any evidence of autonomy being a big influence in the kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. It was actually one of the most important findings, if you would say, or observations for the book, is that in deeper learning schools, teachers have an incredible amount of autonomy and agency about what they teach, how their kids work, and so on. And I think it's just an extension of their expectations for students, right? If you're in a school building where kids are expected to exhibit high levels of agency and ownership and autonomy over how they learn and what they do, then that creates a very sort of divergent model of learning and classwork together, which means then that teachers are free, right, to serve as facilitators, to serve as guides, to put interesting opportunities in front of kids, to basically ask questions rather than just tell them what, transmit information out to them and so on. So it's a much more freeing and liberating modality as an educator. And if you talk to teachers in these buildings, they're like, oh, I can never go back to a traditional school system. It would be just much too stifling and so on, right? Because my students and I, we have the ability to do almost anything we want. And it doesn't mean that there aren't expectations, right? But the expectations are around sort of these much deeper, richer learning outcomes, like be a good problem solver, right? Or be an excellent communicator, or be a fantastic writer, or go make an impact in your community. And there's so much space and divergence in that space, right? Which is very different from sort of, we're going to try and make every single kid learn exactly the same thing and then assess them on the exact same low-level assessment. And then, of course, when the diverse humanity of our community pushes back on that or is unsuccessful at that, then that causes anxiety and stress. And we try to make the system even more technocratic and fit everybody through the little square hole that we've created for people, rather than letting us be who we are as humans. So, the ongoing cycle of education reform for the last few decades has been, how do we make education even more technocratic and more standardized in the face of an increasingly diverse humanity of students that meets us? And that's what puts pressure on kids and teachers.
Have you seen any schools that have done that you've worked with, that have done a really phenomenal job of bringing their parents along with this mindset and excitement about change and the potential of what it can do for their kids? Have you seen anybody do it really well?
So I know Lee raised his hand. I want to give him a chance to speak. I'm just going to say real quickly that almost every single deeper learning school has done a great job of getting parents and families on board, because it's such a different model compared to more traditional systems that you have to have family buy-in from the get-go. So you can walk into almost any deeper learning school and you've got parents who are in because they're mostly, choosing that for their kids. So, Lee, what do you got?
Yeah, now your deeper learning schools, are they typically charter schools and that sort of thing? Because one of the things we run into is in our nearby districts, we're running into the situation where if they don't test it, they don't teach it. And it means that they're losing out on social studies. They're now teaching science again because they're testing it. How are you dealing with that?
Right. So again, it's sort of the difference between a startup school and a transition school, right? If you're a charter school, you have more flexibility.
Sure.
But even if you're a school within a school, or you're an independent program that sits over here, you know, in like an alternative program, or you're a pilot or whatever, right? You're still subject in all those mechanisms to the same assessment expectations that more traditional schools are, right? Like you still have to have your kids take the state test and blah, blah, blah. I think what's fascinating to me is that the Hewlett Foundation has done a lot of research on deeper learning schools and has found very consistently that students in these environments do better on standardized assessments of low-level content than most schools do, even though they don't emphasize low-level content. Because what they're doing is they're narrowing the curriculum and saying, this is the really important stuff, right? So we're getting away from the mile-wide, inch-deep model. We're saying, these are the really important, essential, enduring understandings or power standards, or whatever you want to call them, right? From Wiggins and Mattei. And we're saying, and we're going to go deep, deep, deep on these in a rich, robust, hands-on, applied way, in a conceptual way, so the kids really get it. And then when kids hit the assessment, they know their stuff so well, the important stuff really well, that they actually do better on those tests than the folks over here are like, oh, well, we can't do that work because we need our kids to pass the test.
And so it's really, they've got the context of the actual application of it. So it makes more sense, and it's easier for them to actually understand and
right. And kids find meaning and relevance in their work in a much more robust way than over here, where they're skimming across the top and they never get a chance to find meaning in anything. So they just forget it 3 weeks later. So our excuses for why we don't go this direction actually are not borne out by the research.
Don't you think it's also, I mean, I'm more interested in I don't know what the statistics are and how much kids actually retain. Was it 15% after a certain amount of time? It's something ridiculous. I'm more interested in the skills, habits of minds, processes that kids learn and adapt and internalize, so that they can adapt to any situation and learn and enjoy learning. And so I think that's what seems to me. And this is not a new thought either. I mean, critical thinking skills we've talked about for years and years and years, but schools letting go of the content and focusing on that seems to be a really hard sell because of this standardized testing. And I don't know, how you let go of it unless it feels to me that schools that are struggling have more latitude for taking risk, and doing things really differently. I put a link into a school network in LA that Don and I know somebody who just started working for them, and hopefully he's going to come talk to us in a few weeks, where they build in a 5th year, so kids actually graduate with a BA. They also partner, part of their campuses are on the campus of different corporations. It's really different. And like that kind of risk taking in doing things really different, it just seems like it's such a heavy lift for people when we have this testing bearing down on us. And I don't know how that's ever going to change if we don't call out some of the inequities that result of that testing.
So again, I'm going to sort of parse out our current assessment mandates from states and the feds as being different from the learning and teaching modalities in which we operate to meet those mandates, right? And again, those mandates exist across the board in every state, and yet we have 1,000, 2,000 deeper learning schools, right? And the research shows very clearly that those schools actually do better on those mandates than a more traditional system. So it's not the mandate that's the problem. It's our deeply embedded mindset about what schools should look like. And then, of course, you get all the other benefits that go along with the deeper learning environment, like kids are better collaborators, they're better thinkers, they're better problem solvers, They reclaim struggling ninth graders at higher rates than traditional schools. They graduate more kids. They send more kids off to college. A higher percentage of the graduates persist and graduate college, and so on. Like all the things we say are important, right? Like these kids have incredible self-efficacy because they're just in problem-solving mode all the time. And those are the kinds of things that parents and families and communities want for their young people. And so I think we just have to keep remembering that, you know, a school that's explicitly designed for control and compliance and low-level learning is very different from a school that's designed around voice and agency and problem solving and risk taking. And if you want the latter, you have to design for it. And that's where my work is, right? It's really in that day-to-day design work, is that how do we start creating bridging structures that get us to where we know we need to go.
What are the demographics of your deeper learning schools?
So I made some comment over in the side. They vary, of course, school by school across the country, but there's a lot of intentionality in many of these schools to mirror the local demographics, right? So, you know, you look at networks like Big Picture Learning, there's explicitly targeting across the network the kids that are typically underserved in most school systems, and proving that deeper learning models can work with those students. Mm-hmm. So this is not just you know, white middle-class student body issue, right? This is across the board, even when we control for student demographics and community disadvantage, as however we might, you know, define that, these kids are still rocking it, and it's awesome.
Great, thanks.
What's in your heads right now, people? Talk to each other. I don't need to do all the talking.
I have a question. You know, it feels like we're talking a lot about public schools. My experience has been in international independent schools. What differences do you see there between the public and independent schools?
Yeah, thanks, David. So I do a little bit of work with independent schools, you know, NAIS and some international schools. In some ways, they're a little more self-satisfied. You know, I live in Boulder County, and I just got to tell you that, you know, the Boulder School District is also kind of a self-satisfied district, because the demographics of the community are like, our kids are fine, right? And whatever the world throws at them, they're going to be great, because, you know, of all the social capital and family capital that's in our community. And I think we see a lot of that in independent schools and international schools as well, right? I think the interesting dialogues with independent international schools around things like, does your IB program go far enough, right? In terms of creating the kind of deeper learning opportunities for kids that you really want. It's a start, right? But is that, you know, like, are you going to stop there, you know, like, and call it quits and call it a day? Or is there more that we could do with young people? I had this really interesting conversation with Michael Horn. It was part of a deep dive 2-day conversation with some folks at NAIS. And he was making the point that what we typically see in like metro areas is that there's usually a flagship independent school somewhere, right? So like in Washington, DC, where I grew up, that would be Sidwell Friends. And then all the other independent schools in the DC area, they want to be like Sidwell Friends light, as close as they can be. So they all try to do as much as possible like Sidwell Friends. And the point he was trying to make is that there's actually incredible opportunity for some differentiation in the independent school market, right? Where, what if you wanted to be a STEAM magnet independent school, right? Like you could be completely different from Sidwell Friends and have like this really robust market, right? For families who would love what you're offering. So instead of trying to be Sidwell Friends light, create your own interesting model. Parents will come, right? But most independent schools are afraid to do that. And so that market differentiation isn't there. So there's lots of possibilities. I think about like a Mount Vernon Presbyterian school down in Atlanta. They have gradually transitioned themselves over time from a typically AP focused independent school to a very PBL inquiry focused independent school, right? And they've just made that transition over time where they kind of wrapped up their old families, you know, under the old program and got them graduated and so on. And meanwhile, brought in new families who wanted the new model. And now they're thriving in this new space. And they have this wonderfully intentional transition space. So I think the question for all of us, whether we're independent, international, public, whatever, right, is how brave are we going to be in the face of no needs? Or are we going to continue to pretend that they don't exist out there and keep trying to shove old models of schooling on our families?
Liz has a really good question in the chat. Liz, do you want to grab the mic and ask Scott?
Sure. I mean, you just said something so important, right? Independent schools are so afraid of being different, but that's true of every school. Everyone in the school system is afraid. of what? What is everyone so afraid of? And how do we overcome that? How do we overcome this fear of, it's not even like failing, especially in public education. Like, your school isn't going to fail. Like, well, like I don't know. It's just so interesting to me that everyone all the time, I'm scared, I can't, I'm scared, we can't do, like, that whole, there's just this fear embedded in so much of our education system. And I don't understand where it comes from. And I don't understand how to fix it, or where to go, or how to support teachers and leaders and everyone in the education to get out of that mindset.
So Liz, I'll offer one thought on that, which is this. Most educators were successful as students themselves in environments of control and compliance and rule following and doing what the teacher in school told you. And so much so that they wanted to replicate that by becoming educators themselves, right? And so when you have an entire generations of educators who were raised in just tell me what to do environments and there's just one right answer, then all of a sudden you're talking about a divergent model of schooling in which there isn't just one right answer. And that makes people really anxious.
Agree. I also have this idea that teachers have absolutely no idea what happens in the real world. And, I was a teacher for over 10 years and then stepped out of the classroom to start Winemaker and experienced the whole world of careers and people and jobs doing incredibly amazing, unique, diverse things. And the teachers in the classroom are like, well, kids, when you grow up, you could be a doctor, a lawyer, or a firefighter. Like, right? I think there's a huge disconnect between teachers who went to school, then went back to school to learn about school, and then went to school again to understand that these, it's not just lip service. Our kids actually need these skills. And, you hear of programs like Google's like entry program where they like reteach their new hires how to function, is really like undermining everything the kids have done for the last 16 years. And it breaks my heart to be like part of that. But yeah, that's all.
Yeah, Liz, I agree. I don't know why people are so afraid, but I always bring it back to the primary deliverable of most high schools in the United States is to get into college, not necessarily to learn or enjoy learning, and this is what we aim for all of the time. And this is the fear factor. We sort of just go backwards, I feel, because that's what it is. It's about getting into college.
And I agree. I think that's the end product for a lot of the parents in independent schools who are paying for a premium product. And so I think there needs to be some educating of the parent body, in these schools too. Scott has to go at the top of the hour because he's a very busy person, and I don't want to keep him longer. But my suggestion would be is I put his Twitter ID in the chat earlier, and I'll put it in there again, and you can send him another question if you'd like to. We have a longer question that's in the chat right now, and we'll stick around and try and answer it once Scott goes. But if you want to reach out to Scott, here's his contact information. He's putting it in the chat right now. And I think this has been a fabulous conversation. We have set up an Amazon book club, and I will also put that in the chat where you can access his most recent book or purchase his most recent book. And hopefully we'll have some discussions in the next couple of weeks about it too, as we progress. Next week, we're going to have Susie Boss here, who is in the audience, and she's kind of like the perfect one too for this series. So Susie, we're excited to have you here as well. You're all welcome to come to any of these and drop in as you can. We also have a professional learning community where we have a Slack group behind the scenes. If you're interested in joining that and being more of a thought partner in this group, send me an email at Lucy Gray Consulting. But before we go, I just want to give Scott the final word. Scott, what's your words of wisdom to teachers out there going forward in this pandemic, and what's your final words of hope for people?
small changes add up over time, right? So small shifts in classrooms, pilot projects in schools, you know, this little initiative over here that serves 20 to 40 kids, all those are seeds that we can plant and protect and grow and figure things out, right? While we figure out some of the larger system stuff over here. And what we're doing is we're building our capacity, we're building our parents' capacity, we're building our students' capacity, our educators' capacity to see what it could look like instead and to start getting good at it. And so never, never underestimate the power of small seeds, pilot projects, intentional tweaks that you reflect upon later, because those are the building blocks that bridge us to these larger mechanisms.
Awesome. Incremental change is the way to go. Thanks, Scott. I'll let you go now. If anybody wants to stick around and chat, we'll be here. But Scott, we'll see you later. Thank you so much for doing this. And I'll be back in touch with the recording and everything shortly. Okay?
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
It's great to see you. Be well.
Take care. You too.
Bye.
Bye. So everyone, if you want to stick around,